All right, well, welcome to the 52nd annual meeting of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. This is our session today on race, trust, and police legitimacy, analysis of perceptions and experiences with the police. Today we have three presenters, Simone Butler, Joe Porter, and Malia Thorton, all from Loyola Marymount University in LA. I want to make a programmatic note. The program has this listed as a panel. This is in fact a poster session. So the time frames will be modified as a result, so it'll probably be shorter. But I also want to honor that format, which means that we're going to try something a little different. I want to give the audience the opportunity to interact individually with each presenter. So I'm going to try to break you out into 3 breakout rooms after the presenters present their posters so that you can ask them questions individually. And then we'll come back and I'll provide some brief feedback on their posters as well. We're going to try it. I don't know that it'll work, but we're gonna do our best. So with that being said, I want to welcome this undergraduate panel to INCOPE. I think this is, Malia said this is your first. Is it everyone's first? Good. I came as an undergraduate. It's been a valuable experience. I'm still coming several years later, so I welcome you. And I hope that this is a formative and useful experience for you and that you continue to join us in our annual meetings every March. That being said, I'm going to turn it over to Malia so that we can get started. Let's give us a presentation. She'll share her screen and talk to us about her poster. And then we will move to Jill and then Simone.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Malia Thornton, and today I am presenting Who Does the LAPD Protect and Serve? An examination of Black Angelenos and their perceptions of the LAPD. The motto of the LAPD is to protect and serve. They even go so far as to claim it's a way of life for their police officers. A guiding principle for their police officers that informs or should inform how they interact with and treat Los Angeles residents and communities. However, conclusions from the 2020 Police and Community Relations Survey conducted by the Center for the Study of Los Angeles shows a very different reality for Black city residents. Although on the surface, it may appear that Los Angeles residents are generally satisfied with the behavior of LAPD officers, as well as the treatment they receive from these officials, once you begin to examine each of these opinions by racial demographic, it paints a much different picture. It's a picture that shows the consequences of decades-long oppression, neglect, and abuse at the hands of the LAPD in Black communities. As you can see from the analysis, Black communities are adamant in their belief that the LAPD is not and has not been fulfilling their duty to serve and protect all people in the city of Los Angeles. Plainly stated, Black residents do not believe that the LAPD has been serving or protecting Black lives. The differences observed in the perceptions of the LAPD among white, Asian, Latino, Latina, and Black residents in Los Angeles are not simply a matter of coincidence. Black Angelenos' perceptions of the LAPD are evidence that the LAPD does not uphold its duty to Black communities and instead works against them. With that said, my research question aims to examine the difference in opinion between Black and Latino residents and whether they believe that the LAPD perceives them as a threat. And additionally, I ask whether these demographics feel like the LAPD serves to protect people like themselves. You will find in looking at the data presented here that race is a significant variable in the way respondents across all demographics responded to these two questions. And consequently, you will see that the historic and present day neglect by the LAPD on Black communities undoubtedly impacts their perceptions of how well the LAPD stands behind its motto, to protect and serve all of Los Angeles. Thank you all for being here today and giving me the opportunity to present my research. And please feel free to stop by my breakout room and ask any questions that you might have about the research presented here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malia. Jill.
All right. Hello, my name is Jillian Porter, and again, I'm a student at Loyola Marymount University. The title of my presentation is Police-Civilian Relations Personal Attitude Variation by Race. This poster was completed in response to this past summer. Summer 2020 was plagued by police violence that resulted in the death of several Black individuals. As uprisings around the country became increasingly prominent, so did the demand for systemic change or divestment from the American police system, particularly in Los Angeles. Based on the uprisings, Study LA conducted a survey to analyze the attitudes of Los Angeles residents towards the Los Angeles Police Department, or LAPD, particularly to gauge whether or not they're successfully carrying out their mission. For the Study LA survey, initially a focus group of 99 individuals from varying backgrounds was carried out to help with the production of questions. A mixed mode survey, which consisted of phone calls, online, and face-to-face surveys of 1,753 adult LA City residents, was conducted from August 31st to October 25th, 2020. And the margin of error for the survey is plus or minus 2.5%. After review of the data, I developed my research question, which is, for those who have had their attitudes towards the LAPD shaped by personal experiences, are these experiences mostly positive or mostly negative? And how does this differ by race and ethnicity? The treatment of individuals, particularly minorities, by the LAPD has contributed to experiences that have impacted their attitudes towards the department. This data explores the way in which different Los Angeles residents responded to questions concerning police-civilian relations. The data used is unique as it provides insight into the attitudes held by different races and ethnicities regarding experiences with the LAPD. Personal experiences affect the way in which individuals view the department, as this is dependent upon whether individuals' experiences were mostly positive or mostly negative. The first question that I analyzed from the survey was asked, when considering your attitudes towards the LAPD, how much have the following shaped your attitudes? And the responses were either a lot or some, or a little or not at all. And the three categories I chose to analyze were recent events in Los Angeles, historical events in Los Angeles, and events outside of Los Angeles. And to supplement this question, I also analyzed, how would you describe your experiences with LAPD officers? And this question was analyzed by race, and it was determined whether it was mostly positive, mostly negative, or they haven't had any experiences with LAPD. So based on the data for the question, when considering your attitudes towards the LAPD, how much have the following shaped your attitudes? We found that the overwhelming majority, 7 out of 10 of LA residents, have had their attitudes towards the LAPD affected by the events of this past summer. However, when asked, how would you describe your experiences with LAPD officers? Overall, almost 50% of the respondents had mostly positive experiences. But when this data was analyzed by race and ethnicity, it is evident that Black and Latinx responses varied greatly from the Asian white responses. Most notably, Black respondents had a 28% mostly positive experiences with the LAPD, while Latinx responses had a 37% mostly positive experiences with the LAPD. But by contrast, 45% of Asian respondents had mostly positive experiences with LAPD, and overwhelmingly 65% of white respondents had mostly positive experiences. Additional research should be conducted to determine exactly which constitutes mostly positive and mostly negative for these individuals, as these statements most likely have different meanings between each race and each individual. In conclusion, when the data is analyzed by race and ethnicity, it is evident that race and ethnicity play a role in determining that personal experiences with the LAPD are consistent among racial lines. Based on this data, which determines the intersectional discrepancies in police-civilian relations, the LAPD cannot and will not be an equitable institution until impactful change is brought about that reflects their ability to truly protect all individuals through other forms of policing in order to put an end to the harmful, often fatal actions of the Los Angeles Police Department. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, Simone Butler.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Simone Butler, and thank you so much for joining us today. The Los Angeles Police Department is infamous for its history of brutality against unarmed citizens and peaceful protesters. And I wanted to know how these instances of violence might affect levels of trust across various groups in Los Angeles. When we surveyed respondents' ability to trust the police, to trust the following groups to do what is right, we say that about half of Angelenos trust the LAPD. But this is drastically different when we disaggregate the data by race. More often than not, 2/3 of Black respondents and over half of Latina and Latino respondents do not trust the LAPD to do what is right, as compared to 1/3 of white respondents. We also examined trust in local police officers versus trust in the LAPD as a whole, because people tend to have more trust in entities that are closer to home. In this survey, we see the same trend in that residents trust their neighbors more than any other group and trust their local police officers more than they trust the LAPD as a whole. However, this trend does not hold for Black residents. While Latina, Latino, Asian, and white residents do trust their local officers more than the LAPD, Black residents show the same levels of mistrust for both entities. Again, 2/3 of Black residents do not trust the LAPD or their local police officers to do what is right. To me, these results demonstrate the ways in which Black people continue to mistrust the police due to a disproportionate amount of state-sanctioned violence. Looking at other socioeconomic factors, some answers also vary significantly when it came to income. Respondents who make under $40,000 a year were more than twice as likely as respondents with an annual income of $100,000 to $150,000 to say that they never trust the LAPD to do what is right. As for the variable of age, respondents aged 18 to 29 were 3 times as likely not to trust the LAPD than respondents aged 65 and older. Low-income communities of color have been over-policed for decades, and young Black men and women have often been at the forefront of these instances of brutality. So this explains why these communities feel that the LAPD does not have its best interests at heart. This data is confirming something that Black people already know, that there's a serious lack of trust in the police among young, Black, low-income residents of Los Angeles, and we need to come up with a new solution to radically transform our vision of police and public safety. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. That was a great presentation by our 3 panelists. For those of you who are joining us late, I just want to remind you that this is a poster session. And so we're going to try to stay true to that format. And we're going to try to do 3 breakout rooms. I'm going to do that manually. You can toggle between the breakout rooms if you have the updated version of Zoom. If you do not, just simply leave the room and I will assign you to another. I want the presenters to have the opportunity to interact individually so that we can stay true to that format. So give me a moment while I manually assign. Oops. All right. Again, just toggle between the rooms if you can. If not, come back and I will send you elsewhere. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes in the breakout rooms. See you soon.
Did you need something?
I was get married. Pregnant woman.
All right, welcome back. I hope that was a fruitful interaction between the presenters and the audience. I noticed that there wasn't a lot of toggling between the different groups. We actually have a lot of time, so we'll spend the balance of it giving folks the opportunity to talk to some of the other presenters. I want to just talk a little briefly about the papers and my role as a discussant. And so I'm going to start here. So first of all, I want to just applaud the three presenters. This, from my understanding, this survey came about as a function and part of the effort made on their behalf, really advocating their university and centers on their university to actually conduct this study to understand racial differences and experiences with the LAPD. That is a huge undertaking. It cannot be understated. Overstated. It is very difficult to get high quality data at the local level. As political scientists, we know that this tends not to be the locus of focus when we are doing survey data. So the fact that these three students were able to gather such high quality data is a testimony to, I think, their skill and their talent, and I hope for all the things to come. So this is a representative sample of 1,700 adult residents from the city of Los Angeles. Just from a methodological perspective and thinking about some of the benefits, there are really just no shortcomings in the data. It's multilingual, which in a city like Los Angeles is incredibly important, that respondents are able to take a survey that is in their native language. That is very difficult to do. It requires a lot of resources, and yet here they have a multilingual survey. So that's a great benefit. It's also mixed mode. It's not simply phone. It's using a variety of methods to collect responses. This is important because we know that African Americans, Latinos, particularly those for whom English is not a second language, are less likely to respond to surveys on the telephone. So the fact that we have a mixed approach is also a benefit and increases the value and the robustness of the work. Third, it focuses on a local context. I study cities, and I'm a survey researcher and a political psychologist. And one of the greatest frustrations in this line of work is that there's very little data that focuses on the opinions and attitudes of residents in a local context. It does not happen, and when it does happen, it does not happen at a high level. And so the fact that we have this data here that focuses on a local context allows us to generate theories. In political science, there's often concern and questions about generalizability of focusing on a local municipality. But sometimes all you're concerned with is the local context, and that's sufficient because it allows you to tell a fuller story about what's going on in place, right? And when we talk about race, class, and gender, we're also talking about geography, which is a missing factor. So the fact that this is focused on LA, I think is immensely important. One of the lessons that political scientists have yet to learn or learn well, or those who study policy sciences, is the importance of disaggregating data by race. One of the things that each of the presenters did is showing the aggregate and how that aggregate might tell us one particular story about feelings, perceptions, and beliefs about public systems, notably the LAPD. But once you disaggregate that data, it tells a very different story. We saw that at the beginning of COVID as well, with public health officials saying, we need to disaggregate that data to understand the differential effect of this virus on communities of color. And so you follow that model here and have disaggregated the data. And it allows for us to tell a richer story about how people of color are experiencing the administrative state in LA. What I'd like to do is to get you all thinking a little bit generatively about, sorry, I had to add someone in, theorizing the relationships between the variables, right? The specific outcomes of interest that you focused on in its relationship to race. Also to expand on your thinking about the implications of these relationships, and kind of a favorite social science questions, what measures do you wish you had, right? Oftentimes we have to make trade-offs, or there are decisions to leave certain instrument items off, but thinking more about what you'd like to know, what was not present, and what you'd like to do with this work. So I've got 2 questions for each of the panelists. I'm going to start with Malia. And the first is, what drives the sense of threat that African Americans are experiencing or sensing in LA? And what are the implications of this limited feeling of protections? What I like about your poster is that you focus on this idea of serve and protect, which is a model shared by many police departments across the United States. Yet we have only a tongue-in-cheek idea that that is not what that actually does, or how citizens of a particular city interpret that. But what are the implications when people don't feel that a public agency in the police department is not actually engaging in the serving and protecting role? So I'll open it up to you to kind of give some thoughts about that.
Sure. If you don't mind, I'll start with the second question.
Sure.
So what are the implications of limited feelings about protections? The first thing that came to my mind hearing this question was there's just a complete lack of trust. The LAPD is supposed to be an agency, obviously, upholding, you know, the dignity of its citizens and also protecting them. And so when you don't feel protected by the very people that are supposed to be protecting your life, there's going to be no trust between you and that agency. And I think that's exactly what's happening between LA City residents and the LAPD. There is a severe lack of trust that between that relationship, and that goes on to have negative consequences in the way that I think interactions happen between those groups. And I think additionally, the lack of interactions or the lack of positive interactions just furthers this kind of lack of trust. And so going to the first question, what drives this sense of threat? I would say that for Black residents, maybe even present day and historically, the sense of threat is just driven by observations of LAPD's treatment on Black city residents. It's no secret that the LAPD has a very serious history of violence against Black communities. And I think, you know, that history never goes away. And it's those stories, that reality is carried across, you know, decades, across generations. And additionally, it hasn't really stopped. It might have taken new forms. It may look a little different, but at the end of the day, abuse and neglect at the hand of police departments are still happening. And I think not even just observations of the LAPD, but I think nationwide, you know, we have, you know, social media as a tool, and these videos are shared instantly of police in different counties, different cities across the country, really, I mean, just being violent towards Black people. And so, you know, you see that on a constant basis. You see it there. It seems like there's a new video every month of a police officer or security guard, you know, being violent towards a Black person. It's going to influence the way that you see your own city and community police. And so I think that's what really drives the sense of threat. But I do want to add that it's like, this sense of threat is very grounded and rooted in something real. It's not just a perceived threat. I would argue that the way Black residents feel about the LAPD is rooted in how the LAPD has historically treated Black people. It's not just based on something, you know, something that doesn't really, you know, is not really grounded. It's extremely visible in the history of the LAPD and its treatment of Black residents.
Okay, thank you. I want to complicate that for you a little bit.
Okay.
So why is trust important as a concept? Why is it important for a citizenry in a democracy to have trust for their government? And so in some ways, you're also talking to Simone, Simone's work as well, right? How do you answer the question if nearly a third of African Americans say they have not had a negative experience with the LAPD? So how do you respond to that idea that that sense of threat may be inflated if a third or nearly a third of African Americans are saying we haven't had any negative experience with LAPD?
Yeah, as as I was like thinking about a response to this question, Dr. Crowder, my professor, typed in the chat, trust is related to legitimacy. And I believe that as well. I think without trust, these institutions aren't legitimate. And I don't think they can say that they're doing their job. And so even though there is a population, a certain amount of Black residents that don't have, you know, certain kinds of interactions with the LAPD, that does not make up for the Black residents that have had these interactions, that don't have trust in the LAPD, because ultimately, you know, those experiences cannot be discounted, and those experiences do, I would argue, lessen the legitimacy of the institution and the work that it does.
Mhm.
And I would say that goes beyond the LAPD and definitely stems into the Los Angeles government, because all of those actors are players in this system of just like, that allows this neglect and abuse to occur. So I hope that gets to your question.
Yeah, no, that was exactly what I was looking for. The point about legitimacy is absolutely right? So the relationship between trust is when it's eroded, you're also eroding the legitimacy of these actors, right? And so if the police are concerned about compliance, they should also be concerned about cultivating greater legitimacy, which means that they also have to increase their trust, right? So that was great, thank you. Okay, so Jill, also really love this presentation. I wanted you to talk a little bit about maybe the importance of, do you prefer Jill or Jillian? I think you signed off as Jill in your email.
Jillian.
Jillian, I apologize. What about vicarious experiences? So you talked a little bit about kind of this, or at least the way that one might interpret the survey questions, that these are direct experiences that African Americans are having with the police. But what about vicarious experiences? Knowing someone that has had an interaction with the police, can you speculate a little about what you might imagine that finding to produce?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, for the first one, noting about vicarious experiences, I think that's extremely significant, and perception with the LAPD. Just personally, I've never had a negative experience with a police officer or the LAPD more specifically, but I do feel if I were to be pulled over, I would feel that my life is in danger. And I think that that can be said for the broader Black Los Angeles residents, that even though you haven't had a negative experience, to Malia's note, you've seen these videos, you see, you know, these news articles and all these things that police as an institution cannot be trusted. So therefore your life is in danger because they have historically targeted Black and brown individuals. So you can, you know, see yourself in those videos, see yourselves in those news articles, and know that there is like a level of fear to, you know, police as a whole. So.
Awesome. So the other finding about kind of the different events that prime or have people thinking about it. So based on your data, it seems like people in LA are always thinking about this dynamic with the LAPD. So led me to think about, is the conduct or misconduct of the LAPD always accessible in the mind of LA residents? And if so, what are the consequences of that enduring misapprehension about this particular agency?
I think for the general population of the people that were surveyed, so adult Los Angeles residents, I think that they are thinking about, you know, the misconduct of LAPD or just their actions in general, which for most people, for specifically Black and Latinx residents, they're going to be negative. So I do think that they are always accessible because it's life or death. So, you know, it has to be something that's on your mind when you are put in that sort of situation. And the consequences, I think, you know, as Malia noted, some of them, it can be that your life can be in danger and you don't feel that you have anybody to call. And so you could, you know, your life is just, you're either going to be in danger if you call LAPD, or your life is just going to be in danger because you have no one to call, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And again, it's the institution, like the police institution, is not legitimate if it doesn't have trust from the citizens. So it's just how valid is this institution if, you know, again, if the citizens don't trust it. So what what can be done in order to increase trust. And then that goes to know, like, or that branches off into whether the police system needs to be abolished, if, divestment needs to happen, because we can see that changes within the department are not gonna bring about, anything positive, because historically there is this distrust that's based in reality. So it's just like, where do we go from there? If that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely. Great. Thank you. Okay, Simone. I thought your finding about the generational difference was very interesting. And I wanted you to kind of expound on that and think through what explains that generational finding. And the same question that I posed to Malia as well as Jillian is, what are the implications of mistrusting the police? What issues does that raise?
I feel like opinions on, police and just a lot of political opinions throughout the generations, they kind of get less and less radical. So that was kind of my thought process. When you're young, you just want to, I don't know, you see injustice, at least for like us, for like, most Black people, you see injustice and you just want to kind of like try to combat everything, or just, be, just like, so maybe that's just like my mindset. But I don't know. I think like the generation finding, I personally looked into that because, while we were developing the survey, just speaking with my grandfather and just kind of hearing him say like, oh no, I don't agree with that. That's a little bit too radical. Like, defund the police. Who are you gonna call? And it's like, well, who would we call like if we didn't defund the police? Because I don't feel comfortable, and like I think Jillian mentioned earlier, I personally haven't had an instance of like a police officer putting their hands on me, or like something like super violent, but at the same time I still don't trust the police at all. So I don't know, I feel like it's just like a younger generations just tend to be like more radical in the sense of like not trusting police, and especially just not trusting authority in general. So that was kind of my thought process with that question.
Could it be something more direct, right? So what do we know about who's the most likely to be arrested?
Yeah, and
Right.
definitely it's just young,
They tend to be younger male, right? And so they fall right into this age cohort, right? So that might be one of the driving forces where you're seeing this differential, because these are the individuals who are having more carceral contact, right? But you also raised another interesting question that I want all three of you to kind of think about in terms of complicating kind of this conversation about policing and its future. Some have made this argument that in some places, Black folk are the ones who are more likely to call the police, and trying to reconcile what that means. But it doesn't answer the question about whether or not that's the appropriate response, right? Whether or not we actually need law enforcement or emergency personnel or social worker or mental health, someone with a mental health capacity, right? But that requires us to disentangle quite a bit more. What about the implications of mistrusting the police? And what else does the data that you do have say about some of these dynamics?
Yeah, so definitely like Malia and Jillian mentioned earlier, when young Black people don't trust the police, then it kind of one just delegitimizes it for us, and then I feel like we're just like way less likely to use it. I know for we had a guest speaker come into our class, Phil McHarris, and we kind of talked about alternatives to like solving there's just like some situations that like don't necessarily need like police, but like Dr. Crowder saying, the unarmed model of crisis response to like mental health situations, or just something that could use like a social worker or like somebody more trained in like mental health rather than like police, because I just feel like that's kind of like an extreme that like I feel like police do not need to be like called to every situation or like disturbance. So yeah, in terms of the implications, I would just say definitely delegitimizing it for us, and then just prompting us to look for like, you know, other options in terms of like, okay, well, who can we call, or like, you know, who should be the person to solve this problem for us.
Great, thank you so much. These are wonderful presentations and valuable, incredibly important work for a lot of different reasons. One of the assumptions in thinking about racialized differences in response to the legal system generally is kind of understanding not only the differential, but it often falls on communities of color, and people have a hard time explaining it. But there's another side to it as well, and I think Malia hinted at it earlier, is that the police require the community as well. And they also benefit from information that is derived from these places. And so when you don't have a clear or clean link, that undermines their ability to do the work they claim to do or claim to want to do. But it also raises questions about what police are for that have yet to be answered in the American carceral state. And more importantly, I think the work that you're doing is valuable because political science is very late to this game. I'm gonna throw a little bit of shade. But this is a great book called Black and Blue: How African Americans Judge the US Legal System. But part of its shortcoming is that it developed this idea of positivity theory, which assumed that Americans had a positive relationship with the US legal system. And the data that you just presented suggests that that's wrong, right? And positivity theory had been a leading conceptual framework for a very long time. This book came out in 2018. And in their preface, they basically acknowledge that they were wrong. That they were among the scholars who did not recognize that there were differences among racial groups in terms of feelings or affect about the legal system. And so you three and your advisors should be proud that you all have a little more foresight than senior scholars in the discipline of political science. And I hope that you all continue with this work. It is incredibly important. And I'm very impressed with what you've presented here. So I want to thank you all. We got a few more minutes, so I want to open it up if anyone has additional questions for our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Great job. These are my students, so I am unbiased, but I'm really proud of the work that you all have done. I think in terms of sort of follow-up questions, one question that I kind of want to pose to you all as a group, and those who are in the audience, feel free to chime in as well. But in our class, we engage with Max Felker-Cantor's work on policing Los Angeles. And what we know is that the LAPD has sort of served as a model of policing for the nation. SWAT originated in LA, and a lot of what happens with the LAPD, we see happen in other police departments outside of Los Angeles. And so with that in mind, while we focused on a sort of, local context here, I'm wondering what you think are some of the sort of broader national implications of this research, and what sort of policy change you'd like to see on a broader level.
I think in looking at the LAPD as kind of, I don't want to say like trendsetter for other police departments, but for lack of a better word, we'll go with that. I think if the LAPD were to employ an unarmed model of crisis response, it would definitely influence other police departments in other cities and counties to kind of do the same thing. From our survey research, we know that over 80% of Los Angeles city residents do support this alternative solution of diverting nonviolent situations away from the LAPD towards mental health professionals and social workers. And so the support behind the unarmed model of crisis response is there. And I think if the LAPD seriously considers it and employs it, we can expect to see that sort of change happen, hopefully on a national level.
Thank you.
If I may weigh in real quick, I first want to congratulate all of you for doing this excellent work. I think that this is great work to be done at this time with very interesting questions and questions that really, really matter in terms of having implications for Black politics and for Black people in terms of how we're policed and what we believe about it. I do want to challenge you guys to think about this idea of trust and do a little more theorizing about what are the implications when large proportions of people don't view institutions as being legitimate. Because I think that holds major implications in terms of what protesting will look like, what even attempts to overthrow the government will look like. Because I think that as we get into this area of high polarization, on the left, there is this internal struggle about what democracy and the republic looks like, whether or not the institutions are really adhering to what people want it to do. And on the right, there's this racial rhetoric that seems to be driving those particular individuals. And while your paper don't deal with any of those directly, the implications is there. I think that if we look at one way to go, maybe grounding this in some critiques of social contract theory and how can we consent to an oppressive institution. And so you get the burning down of a federal building in Nashville. You get protesting that looks inherently different and given a lot less grace than the insurrection. But other than that, I thought that these projects were great. They were sophisticated in terms of wrestling with data. And keep up the excellent work. And I know your professor is proud of you. I brought students last year, so I definitely know the work that goes into making certain that they're prepared, getting the projects done, and also having those come to Jesus meetings too. But we're looking forward to having you guys back. And we hope that you will continue to ask important questions and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. And I think that was a really great point. And for the students, I want you all to kind of think back to, Veshla Weaver's work and the ways in which she kind of talks about the police as sort of the face of the state for some people. This is where people are having interactions. This is where political socialization comes for some people who aren't interacting with other political actors. The police are kind of who they see as the government, right? So how might that shape whether or not you view the government as legitimate, whether or not you have political efficacy, whether or not you think your vote matters? And so, I think, what Dr. Riley is pushing you to think about is spot on. And I hope we can kind of continue to sort of wrestle with these topics. We still have a class together. So in class this semester.
No pressure, no pressure.
And they were bragging on their professor and how happy they are to have you there. So
they retracted it all. But I like Dr. Crowder's point. So obviously, Dr. Weaver is kind of pioneering in this space in political science, and her work is foundational. Even her piece on racial authoritarianism has especially important purchase here, and it occupies important real estate. Because in 2016, when the rest of America was wrestling with this idea of, are we backsliding towards authoritarianism? Black folk were saying, well, we've already been there. Like, the United States has always had a racial authoritarian government. But because it didn't affect you, you didn't see it. And so you have to bring those worlds together, right? This idea that police are our government. So one of the things that you'll see in political science, to the frustration of me and Dr. Riley for sure, is this overwhelming focus on politicians, right? Congressional members, senators, state reps, right? And you completely miss the full apparatus of the government. That people who are low income are more likely to engage with. And I can't remember, one of you had a finding, I think Jillian was you, or no, Simone, about the income relationship for individuals in their interactions with the state, right? So the state is this vast apparatus that we tend to only focus on the elected bodies that are a part of it. So there's a lot of ground to be worked on here. And so my salute to you all for touching on it. Thank you. Any other questions?
Dr. Crawford, I saw a question in the chat from Aurelia.
Yes, and you pronounced that correctly. Good work. Yeah, I just had a quick question about Jillian's research. So I noticed that you based it on interactions that people had with the police. I'm wondering if you had kind of a breakdown of what different kinds of interactions there were. So if, say, some people get pulled over, or for example, how many people actually called the police, because I know that generally white folks in LA tend to do most of the calling on the police. So
Yeah, Dr. Crowder and I were just talking about this with Dr. Mack. And I think originally in our data brief, there is information about, it was sort of an open-ended question about which experiences they've had with the police. So some of that was like traffic stops. And I'm not sure what the other ones were, but once the data was, they actually employed the data.
To Aurelio's point, that was the second, so the first most common interaction was traffic stops. The second most common interaction was people calling the police. And so I do think it would be interesting to kind of look at what the racial breakdown is. We know that the LAPD is notorious for pulling Black folks over for nothing. But to your point, we also know that white folks often call the police. And so I think that that could definitely kind of deepen Jillian's research, is understanding, okay, what exactly were those experiences?
But yeah, as of now, we don't have that specific data, but definitely like in the future, that would be something that I'm interested in pursuing.
thank you.
We have about 10 minutes left. So if others have questions or want to engage in open dialogue, I certainly encourage it.
One thing that kind of came up on the last panel that I was in is kind of thinking about the sort of intergroup heterogeneity among Black people and the ways in which they responded to these questions. And Simone, her work and her paper kind of gets to this, that, you know, we see generational differences. We also see differences with regard to like a number of socioeconomic factors, you know, income, education level, whether or not you're a homeowner. And an interesting and complicating thing to kind of think about is in LA, we have this sort of long history of Black police commissioners. Thomas Bradley, who became the mayor of LA, and remember we read about him in Policing Los Angeles, and the Willie Williams, and then now currently, and he came to you all's town hall, the Commissioner Del Bonner, who is also Black. And so I'm just wondering if you all could kind of speak to how we're seeing sort of different Black people respond to these questions in different ways, based on gender, sexuality, race, and like, you know, a number of sort of factors that are at play when it comes to intergroup heterogeneity, because all Black people are not necessarily, you know, in support of these issues, and why might we see some of those differences?
That's a great question. Just to point this book out, one of the things they do here is they think about the difference between linked fate and racial group consciousness, and they find differences when people who are linked fate respond one way, people with a high sense of group consciousness respond a different way, and so there is a lot of heterogeneity here. That's I think a great question.
I wonder how much of it too is class differences in terms of how people experience the police. I'm thinking about Catherine Tate's piece, What's Going On, but she's coming from a different angle. I imagine there's a class of Blacks who are middle class, who are insulated into white suburban areas. And oftentimes there's the assumption that that insulation has a tendency to make them think that they're excluded from these experiences with negative reactions with policing. And so those who perhaps haven't had it, I mean, linked fate is definitely relevant in the Black communities, but I wonder if it's disaggregated by class, and would you really be able to dig in to see who's most likely to have a negative response and view policing differently?
Yeah, one of my students did that and found that, and kind of surprisingly, there were, you would expect some difference, but there were extremely large differences based on class and education level. And during the last panel, one of the professors who was in attendance, Boris Ricks, he suggested that, you know, in LA, and I would argue that probably in other cities too, right? one of the sort of good jobs that Black people can get, good union jobs, during, a lot of the sort of history of was working for the police. And so in some ways, it kind of helped to establish the Black middle class that exists in LA. And so a question, and this also goes to a question that Dr. Crawford posed earlier that I'd like to kind of repose back to you all, is what measures, and you all have a lot of answers and a lot to say about this, I know. What questions or measures do you wish you would have had on the survey that weren't included? And so to speak to that point, as it relates to this question is, had they asked, are you related to the LAPD, right? That could have helped us kind of understand where some of the support is coming from. But I'm curious from the students, what were some of the measures or questions that you wish you would have had?
I have a point, but it's not for this question, but should I still say it? Okay. It was to Dr. Riley's point about like Black individuals moving into like white suburbia and sort of like insulating themselves within that community. And that reminded me of like the vicarious experiences question, because I think once you move into that like social setting, vicarious experiences become obsolete, because typically you might see yourself as like, since you're moving up the social hierarchy, your social status might become more salient than your racial status or your racial group. So you're not seeing yourself as much as a part of the Black community maybe, and you're not associating yourselves with like the Black plight and the problems that this community is facing. So you're not, so these like issues are not as important as like the police state and things like that. Like you're not as angered about like the situations that are, the events that are going on and things like that. But that just reminded me of that question.
I think for me, something, or I wish I could have had, and this is a change that can be made to the survey in the future, pertaining to the questions of, do you think the LAPD perceives you as a threat? And do you think that the LAPD serves and protects people like you? It was formatted as a yes or no style question. I wish it would have been done on a scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree, just because I think it would have been interesting to see, like, disaggregate that data by, race and probably, additionally, class or socioeconomic status, and really get into like the crux of like, okay, who is saying strongly agree that the LAPD perceives them as a threat versus, somewhat agree. Things like that, I think would be very interesting to look at.
Yeah, I agree with what Jillian and Malia said. And just, also, I guess like a feature that I wish, that we could have had was trying to just see more of like those intersections of identity in relation to the questions, because it just was like kind of hard with like the, the formatting, just trying to see like, okay, what do like these specific, like what is the difference between like what gay Black men think than like, straight or, with like like young gay Black men versus like older, up like higher income Black women. So I don't know, just something to like
So like a larger sample size of Black Angelenos.
Yeah, just something that would allow us to see more of like, okay, these differences, like, that you were talking about earlier, these differences, within the racial groupings. Cause I just feel like there's so much like, Black people are just not a monolith. There's just so many different opinions on like, police, but just like, just like in democratic institutions in general, among like Black people. So just like having that, I feel like I would have preferred that.
Great. We are out of time. I want to thank you all again for presenting excellent work and sharing your talent with us. I hope that you revisit us again in the future at InCoach. You're always welcome. And we want to extend our encouragement to you in all your future endeavors. I don't know what year you all are, but we certainly hope to see you again. Thank you so much. Take care and be well and be safe.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
We got to hop off, but I got a beer in my bag. So if you want to get on I got a meeting at 2. So 3. Thank you, sir. All right, we're done. Thank you.